Welcome to Question Mark, a safe place to ask dangerous questions. Where does Palestine come from? Where does the idea of the Palestinian people come from? Now, I think it's an important caveat at the beginning of this video to say in the midst of the current conflict, Palestinians are largely the victims of this war. They're the ones who are oftentimes deeply hurt, wounded, and killed in the midst of a crossfire that they did not ask for. So many of the Palestinians that are out there, some of them are Muslim, some of them are Christian, some of them are secular, but so many of them are just people who would love to live in a peaceable solution where they can raise their kids in peace, where they can educate the next generation and be able to enjoy all of the normal things of life. But they've been caught in a horrible crossfire, and they deserve our compassion on every level for the way they've been hurt in the midst of oppression. The nature of this video is not about that, though. It's about the question of where does the idea of Palestinians come from, and what's the historical nature behind the name and the people who live there. Now, these areas here are the modern-day borders that we have around the region of Palestine or Israel. The orange part is what's known as Israel, bordered by the Mediterranean Sea on this side and the Jordan River on this side. The green areas are the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and the purple area is the nation of Jordan. So if you ask the question, when was the idea of Palestine first conceived? When was it first talked about? Well, the answer is in the 130s AD. In the land of Israel, there was a revolt known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt. At the time, the Romans were in charge and the Jews were rebelling against them. And as a punishment, the Romans not only came in and took over and expelled a whole bunch of the Jews from the area, but they renamed what they called the area. Instead of calling it places like Idumea and Galilee and Judea, the regions that they had talked about at the time, now they began to refer to the whole area as Palestine. Now, Palestine is a word that's a Latinized or Romanized version of the ancient peoples who used to live along the seacoast, who were known as the Philistines. Now, in 1000 BC and during that era, the Philistines were the classic enemies of the people of Israel. They weren't people who were natives to the land, and they weren't from the area of Arabia. They were actually from across the Mediterranean Sea in areas like Cyprus and Greece. And they had settled along the coastline here and became the enemies of Israel. Well, Rome said, hey, Israel, if you are going to rebel against us, we're going to change the name of your land and we're going to name it after your ancient enemies, the Philistines. Now, the Philistines were not currently in the land, and they didn't live in the land, and they don't live in the land today, but that name lived on because the Romans wanted to stick it to the Jews in that moment. Now, as long as Roman rule was happening, through the 400s AD, the name was known as Palestine. But you'll note that the people who lived in the area during the time were primarily Jewish people in the 130s AD, and between 100 and 400, the growing group of people in that area were the Christians. So the area that was known as Palestine was primarily filled with people who were Jews and Christians. Well, over time, the Romans got taken over by various groups, including the Muslims in the 7th and 8th centuries AD, and then the Crusaders, and then the Ottomans. And what's interesting to note is that no literature of the Crusaders or the Muslims or the Ottomans used the term Palestine. So from the time the Romans were finished all the way through until 1917, that word simply wasn't used of this territory at all. But in 1917, World War I finished. The Ottomans had been in charge of this entire land. That would be from the area of Turkey. They were in charge of this entire land, but in the wake of World War I, The French and the British split up the land. And the northern area up here was given to the French to be able to decide what to do, and this area was given to the British. So the British bring back the term Palestine to talk about this area. Only it wasn't just this side of the Jordan River. When they were talking about the Palestinian Mandate that they were in charge of, it was the entirety of this area, including what we now know as Jordan. And in 1917, they were given the mandate to be able to divide that up. Well, there was a temporary semi-autonomous division that happened in 1921 related to this land, but it was really in 1945 that officially and fully this land was given to the Kingdom of Jordan. And they created a new land out of this land that was known as Palestinian. So the land was split. Roughly 2/3 of the landmass was given to the Arabs, and there was an anticipation that this might be given to the Jewish people. Because in 1917, a promise was made from the British called the Balfour Declaration that said, we're going to give part of this land to the Arabs and part of this land to the Jews, and we're going to set up an Arab state and a Jewish state side by side. They'll get to be able to decide what their names are. So they set up this Arab state that we now know as Jordan, and then later on in 1947, they decided to divide up this land of Israel again. So at that point, the remaining area of the Palestinian Mandate was divided into two more sections. One of them was an Arab section, and the other one was a Jewish section. In 1948, Israel was able to put together a constitution and announce the name of their new nation, the Nation of Israel. Now, it's important to note that while these are the current land divisions, there have been different land divisions from 1947 all the way until today. There have been multiple wars and multiple pieces of land that have taken over. There have been multiple accords where land has been exchanged back and forth between Egypt and Israel and the Palestinians and others. So the land boundaries have changed over time. I'm only representing the ones that are current here to this day. But in 1948, the nation of Israel was begun. Now, this is lauded by the Jews as a great time of celebration because for the first time in 2,500 years, they now are in charge of the land that God had promised them. But for the Palestinians, they call this the Nakba, the catastrophe, the worst day in their existence. And what happened during this time as Israel was setting itself up as a nation is that 700,000 people who occupied the land, the Palestinians at the time, fled from the new territory that was known as Israel. Now, there are conflicting reports, depending on which side you're listening to, on whether they fled because they were afraid, they fled because they didn't want to be there, or if they were persecuted and militarily sent out of the land by force. My guess is that there was some of each, and each different side gives different perspectives on this story. But we know that there was a massive migration in a variety of different directions, primarily into the lands that were designated as the Arab lands at the time. At the same time, there was a massive migration of Jewish people into the Jewish land. 200,000 people migrated into the Jewish land and began to set up their homes and be able to create a new life at that point. This is the key point of controversy for the Palestinians in what happened in this area, because some of them legitimately were landowners that left or were driven from their land. Some of them were people who were squatters or nomads, or they didn't own the land that was there. They just happened to be living there at the time. And you can imagine that this becomes a very confusing question of who has rights to what location, at what time, in what place. But we know that the nation of Israel was established, people moved in, they welcomed people to be moving in. In fact, we also know that the nation of Israel welcomed the Palestinians who were living there at the time. There were hundreds of thousands that were living there at the time that actually stayed and became a part of the nation of Israel. The Israel government welcomed them to be a part of it, gave them full rights as human beings, gave them full rights to vote. In fact, many of the Palestinians who are doing best in the Middle East at this point in their lives are the ones who stayed and helped to build that new nation of Israel. Others went to places that are now known as the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, and their lives are not doing as well to this point. Now, the national identity of the Palestinians began to actually form in the 1960s, where they became known as the Palestinians in the wake of a summit that happened in Cairo, Egypt during the 1960s. Now, during this time, they became committed to the elimination of Israel as a nation. In fact, in the 1940s, while Israel became a nation, the Arabs did not create a state. Why is this? Well, a part of creating a state meant that you had to admit that Israel had legitimacy to be in the land and that they could, in fact, create a state themselves. Not being willing to give in to that meant that they didn't create a state for themselves that was side by side with Israel and lived in conflict with the idea that Israel should be in the land at all during that entire time. In the 1960s, they then had some famous declarations. One of the most well-known is the 3 no's. No peace, no recognition, no negotiation. What does this mean? It means that the Palestinians committed that they would not have peace with a nation that's called Israel, that they wouldn't even recognize that Israel was itself a state, and they wouldn't negotiate with any government that called themselves Israel to try to create peace. So we ask, why was it impossible to create the two-state solution? Well, when one of the sides doesn't even want to have the other side in existence, that becomes problematic. Well, moving into the 1980s and the 1990s, there was an organization called the Palestinian Liberation Organization that actually did decide that they would begin to negotiate with Israel for some land settlements, for some peace, and for legitimacy as a government. And there were some historic accords that came into play, one of the most famous of which was the Oslo Accords. And in the Oslo Accords, they made agreement about land settlements in the West Bank, and there's another video where we'll be capitalizing on that entire question at some point, and that the Gaza Strip would be given fully to those who were in the Palestinian movement. Now, the Israelis continued to have a presence in the Gaza Strip until 2005, when they removed themselves and allowed full self-governance and full self-military power inside the Gaza Strip. And then in 2007, the people of Gaza decided to elect Hamas to be their leaders, to be their political representatives. They were the ruling political party at the time. But the problem is that Hamas is a terrorist organization that's funded by Iran and did not have the best interests of the Palestinians in mind. As a matter of fact, as their charter, the basis of their charter is the elimination of Israel rather than the good of the Palestinian people. And this has been reflected in their education, in their training, and in their military activity, sending wave after wave of rockets into Israel, wave after wave of suicide bombers to go into Israel, because their primary agenda has been the elimination of the state of Israel. You may have even heard the term that has become a rally cry for the Palestinian cause: from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. What they're referring to when they talk about that is that from this river, the Jordan River, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestine must be free. What you can see that they're saying there is not just that the Palestinians who live in the territories that are marked as Palestinian should be free. No. They're saying that all of Israel should cease to exist, certainly as an entity, but most people think it is a genocidal call for the elimination of the Jews in general, because they don't want to have any Israel that is even in their backyard at all. Hamas has been a terrorist and genocidal organization for many years up to this point, and they're the ones who are the primary oppressors of the Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip. Because what they want to do is eliminate Israel, and they use the people of Palestine as human shields and as pawns and as toys in this process in order to generate bad publicity for Israel. Even the recent attacks that they've had on October 7th, where they went in and raped and killed and murdered and bombed and took as hostages innocent citizens, is a clear testimony of just how little they care about human life. Their hopes were to provoke Israel to attack them in return in order to be able to create bad publicity against Israel in a worldwide movement. These people are the face of evil, and it's the Palestinians who wind up paying the price as a result of the evils of Hamas and the war that they have drawn Israel into. As I mentioned at the top of the video, my compassion is very high for the Palestinians. For Palestinians who are Muslims, who are Christians, who are secular, who are moms and dads that just want to raise their kids well. And as we pray for the peace of Jerusalem, as it says in Psalm chapter 1, verse 22, we're praying not just for the peace of Israel, we're praying for the peace with the Palestinians as well. Jerusalem itself exists right here on the border of Palestinian and Israel territory. And so as we pray for the peace of Jerusalem, we pray for peace for both peoples, because in them there are millions of people who both matter to God. May God be glorified, may there be peace for both people, and may evil be eliminated. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and click the like and subscribe below to see more things like it, or just go ahead and ring the bell, and that will give you notifications every time another one of our videos comes up. If you'd like to see another video very similar to this, how about looking at this one right here?